Margaret Henley signed the adoption papers with trembling hands, finalizing the placement of 8-year-old Timothy Walsh with his adoptive parents, Mr. and Mrs. Timothy Walsh, a childless couple in their 30s who lived on Elm Street in Minneapolis. The impossibility of the situation wasn't immediately apparent until Margaret realized she was facilitating Timothy's adoption by his own adult self, and a woman who would become his wife 20 years in the future. For 6 months, Margaret had been processing similar placements through the Minneapolis Children's Aid Society, matching orphaned children with adoptive families who were somehow the same people decades older. The phenomenon had begun after Margaret purchased a filing system from the estate of Dr. Helena Blackwood, a child psychologist who had died while researching what she called temporal family dynamics, the study of how family relationships could transcend normal chronological boundaries to create stable homes for children across different periods of their own lives. Margaret Henley had worked as an adoption coordinator for the Minneapolis Children's Aid Society for 8 years, specializing in finding permanent homes for children whose parents had died in industrial accidents, disease outbreaks, or the various tragedies that created orphans in early 20th century urban America. Her reputation was built on careful matching between children's needs and families' capabilities, ensuring that adoptive placements would create lasting bonds that served the best interests of all parties involved. The transformation in Margaret's adoption methods began in April 1915 when she attended an estate sale at Dr. Helena Blackwood's house on Summit Avenue. The child psychologist had been found dead in her office, surrounded by adoption files that contained impossible family trees showing children being raised by older versions of themselves. University officials couldn't explain Dr. Blackwood's research methods, but they were eager to dispose of her professional materials, which seemed to document adoption placements that violated every principle of conventional family structure. Most social workers avoided Dr. Blackwood's filing system, perhaps concerned about the professor's reputation for unconventional theories about child development and family relationships. Margaret saw only an opportunity to acquire organizational materials that would help her manage the increasing number of orphaned children requiring placement services. She purchased the entire filing system for $15, including several case studies that Dr. Blackwood had compiled about temporal family placement strategies. The first indication that something unusual was happening came when Margaret began using Dr. Blackwood's filing methods to organize her current caseload. The system included detailed questionnaires for prospective adoptive families that asked strange questions about their memories of childhood experiences, their knowledge of future events, and their willingness to accept children who might seem familiar despite having never met them before. But the most peculiar aspect of Dr. Blackwood's system was a collection of family photographs that seemed to show the same people at different ages interacting as if they were related. Children appeared in photos with adults who looked exactly like older versions of themselves, creating family portraits that suggested adoptive relationships between people and their own future selves. Margaret initially dismissed these photographs as coincidences or tricks of lighting that made unrelated people appear similar. But when she began matching children with families using Dr. Blackwood's criteria, she started noticing uncanny resemblances between adoptive parents and the children they wanted to adopt. The similarities went beyond physical appearance to include personality traits, interests, and behavioral patterns that suggested deeper connections than normal adoption relationships would explain. The Timothy Walsh case was Margaret's first conscious recognition that she was facilitating impossible adoptive placements. When Mr. and Mrs. Timothy Walsh applied to adopt an 8-year-old boy, Margaret was struck by the husband's physical resemblance to young Timothy Walsh, one of the children in her care. The similarity was so exact that they could have been the same person photographed 25 years apart. During the placement interview, Mr. Walsh demonstrated knowledge about Timothy's preferences, fears, and personality quirks that couldn't be explained through the brief information provided in the adoption file. He knew that Timothy was afraid of thunderstorms, but loved the smell of fresh bread, that he preferred sleeping on his left side, and that he had a habit of humming while drawing pictures. This intimate knowledge suggested familiarity that was impossible unless Mr. Walsh had somehow known Timothy for years. But the most disturbing aspect of the placement was Mrs. Walsh's behavior toward Timothy during their first meeting. She treated him not as a potential adoptive son, but as someone she had been missing and was finally able to reunite with. She knew details about Timothy's life in the orphanage that she shouldn't have known, and she spoke to him using nicknames and references that implied a long-standing relationship. When Margaret questioned these apparent inconsistencies, the Walsh couple explained that they had been waiting specifically for Timothy because they knew he was meant to be their son. They provided character references from neighbors who confirmed that they had been preparing for Timothy's arrival for months, even though they had only applied for adoption the previous week. Against her professional training and personal instincts, Margaret approved the Timothy Walsh placement, filing the paperwork under Dr. Blackwood's special placement category for families whose relationships couldn't be documented through conventional adoption procedures. The adoption proceeded smoothly, with Timothy adapting to his new home with remarkable ease, as if he was returning to familiar surroundings rather than starting a new life with strangers. The success of the Walsh placement encouraged Margaret to continue using Dr. Blackwood's temporal family dynamics approach with other difficult cases. Over the following months, she facilitated dozens of adoptions between children and adults who shared impossible similarities, creating family relationships that defied every principle of normal child placement, while somehow providing loving homes for children who had previously been considered unadoptable. Before I continue with the revelation that would expose the true nature of these impossible family relationships, I need to know you're ready for this journey into temporal impossibility. If you've ever met someone who seemed instantly familiar despite being a complete stranger, or if you've experienced a sense of destiny about relationships that couldn't be logically explained, write familiar strangers in the comments along with your city. Subscribe now, because what Margaret discovered about temporal family dynamics will challenge everything you thought you knew about identity, destiny, and the nature of human relationships. Margaret's investigation into the true nature of her adoption placements led her to examine Dr. Helena Blackwood's personal research files, which had been included with the filing system she had purchased. The professor's notes revealed a theory about temporal family relationships that was based on the premise that family bonds could transcend normal chronological boundaries, allowing people to form meaningful relationships with past and future versions of themselves and their relatives. Dr. Blackwood's research suggested that certain individuals possessed what she called temporal family sensitivity, the ability to recognize and connect with people they were destined to have significant relationships with, regardless of when those relationships were supposed to occur in normal chronological sequence. Children with this sensitivity could form immediate bonds with adults who were actually older versions of themselves or people they would meet later in life. The professor's case studies included detailed documentation of adoption placements where children had been successfully matched with families through temporal family dynamics rather than conventional compatibility assessments. These placements had resulted in unusually strong family bonds that developed more quickly and lasted longer than adoptions based on traditional matching criteria. But Dr. Blackwood's research also revealed disturbing patterns in the children who were candidates for temporal family placement. Most were orphans whose parents had died in circumstances that suggested their deaths might not have been accidental. Industrial accidents, house fires, and disease outbreaks had created specific orphans at specific times, as if someone was orchestrating family disruptions to make particular children available for temporal adoption. Margaret's investigation into these death patterns led her to discover that many of the families who had lost children in tragic circumstances were the same families who later applied to adopt children through temporal family dynamics. Parents whose children had died were being matched with orphan children who were somehow connected to their lost offspring across different periods of time. This discovery suggested that temporal family placement wasn't just about finding homes for existing orphans. It was about reuniting families whose natural relationships had been disrupted by death, accident, or other circumstances that could be overcome through careful chronological manipulation. Children who died young could be replaced by older versions of themselves from different timelines, while parents who lost children could adopt past or future versions of their own offspring. But the most disturbing implication of Dr. Blackwood's research was that the tragic circumstances creating orphans might be deliberately orchestrated to facilitate temporal family placements. Someone was engineering family disruptions to create adoption opportunities that couldn't occur through natural family development, suggesting a systematic manipulation of life and death to serve experimental purposes. Margaret realized that her adoption work had become part of a larger experiment in temporal family engineering that treated human relationships as data points in research designed to test theories about the nature of identity, destiny, and family bonds. The children she was placing weren't just finding new homes. They were being used to prove or disprove hypotheses about whether people could form meaningful relationships with alternate versions of themselves and their relatives. The scope of this experimentation became clear when Margaret discovered that temporal family placement was being conducted in multiple cities throughout the United States, with adoption agencies in Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and other major urban centers participating in coordinated research that tested different approaches to chronological family manipulation. But Margaret's most shocking discovery was that she herself had been adopted through temporal family dynamics as a child. Her adoptive parents, the Henleys, had been an older version of herself and a man she would meet later in life. Margaret had been raised by her own future self without realizing the true nature of her family relationships, and her career in adoption work had been guided by unconscious memories of her own temporal placement experience. This revelation explained Margaret's unusual skill at identifying compatible adoption matches and her intuitive understanding of children's emotional needs. She had been unconsciously applying lessons learned from her own experience with temporal family dynamics, using knowledge that she shouldn't have possessed about how these impossible relationships could be successfully maintained. But the discovery also meant that Margaret's adult life had been predetermined by her childhood adoption experience. Her career choices, personal relationships, and even her decision to purchase Dr. Blackwood's filing system had been influenced by temporal family programming designed to ensure that she would continue facilitating the same type of placements that had shaped her own upbringing. Margaret faced a moral dilemma that had no precedent in human experience. The temporal family placements she had been facilitating were providing loving homes for children who might otherwise never find permanent families, and they were reuniting family members whose relationships had been disrupted by circumstances beyond their control. But they were also part of an experimental program that manipulated life and death to serve research objectives, and they were violating fundamental principles about individual identity and free will. The children involved in temporal family placement were developing into healthy, well-adjusted adults, but they were doing so without understanding their true relationships to their adoptive families. They were living lives based on carefully constructed illusions about their own identities and family histories, never knowing that their most important relationships were with alternate versions of themselves and their relatives. Margaret's investigation revealed that temporal family dynamics research was connected to government agencies that were interested in developing population control methods for social engineering purposes. The ability to manipulate family relationships across different time periods could be used to control reproduction, inheritance, and social development in ways that would allow authorities to shape human society according to predetermined objectives. But the research also had implications for individual identity and consciousness that extended far beyond social control. If people could form meaningful relationships with alternate versions of themselves and their relatives, it suggested that individual identity might be more fluid and transferable than conventional psychology assumed. The temporal family experiments were testing whether consciousness and personality could be maintained across different chronological contexts and family structures. The most disturbing aspect of this research was that it required systematic manipulation of life and death to create the family disruptions necessary for temporal adoption placement. People had to die at specific times and in specific ways to make particular children available for adoption by their own future selves or alternate family members. The research was literally killing people to test theories about temporal family relationships. Margaret realized that exposing the temporal family dynamics program would require her to acknowledge her own participation in experimental research that had violated the rights and safety of hundreds of children and families. But it would also require her to confront the possibility that her own identity and relationships were artificial constructs created for research purposes rather than authentic human connections. The decision became urgent when Margaret learned that the Temporal Family Dynamics program was planning to expand its operations to include not just adoption placement, but comprehensive life planning that would control people's educations, careers, marriages, and reproductive choices according to experimental objectives. Temporal family research was evolving into temporal society research that would manipulate entire communities across different time periods. But Margaret also discovered that she wasn't the only adoption worker who had begun questioning the nature of temporal family placement. Social workers in other cities had started investigating similar patterns in their own caseloads, and some had begun organizing resistance to experimental programs that were using children as research subjects without their knowledge or consent. This network of concerned social workers was secretly documenting temporal family dynamics operations and gathering evidence that could expose the research program to public scrutiny and legal challenge. But they were also facing the same moral dilemmas that Margaret confronted. The programs they wanted to expose were providing genuine benefits to children who needed homes and families, even if the methods being used violated ethical and legal standards. The Resistance Network had also discovered that several adoption workers who had attempted to expose temporal family dynamics research had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, suggesting that the research program was willing to eliminate threats to its operations through violence if necessary. Margaret realized that joining the resistance would put her own life in danger while also potentially disrupting adoption services that were helping vulnerable children. But the choice became clear when Margaret learned that Timothy Walsh, the 8-year-old boy she had placed with his own adult self, had begun showing signs of psychological distress that suggested he was unconsciously recognizing the impossible nature of his family relationships. The child was experiencing identity confusion and anxiety that could develop into serious mental health problems if the temporal family dynamics continued without his conscious understanding of what was happening. Margaret realized that the temporary benefits of temporal family placement weren't worth the long-term psychological damage that could result from raising children in relationships based on chronological manipulation and identity confusion. The research program was creating family bonds that seemed beneficial in the short term, but were fundamentally unstable because they were based on deception about the nature of human identity and family relationships. On November 15, 1915, Margaret made her decision to expose the Temporal Family Dynamics program despite the personal and professional consequences she would face. She had gathered sufficient evidence to demonstrate that adoption agencies were participating in experimental research that manipulated children's lives without appropriate consent or oversight, and that the research was connected to government programs designed to control population development for social engineering purposes. Margaret's exposure of the Temporal Family Dynamics program created the largest child welfare scandal in American history up to that point. Congressional investigations revealed that adoption agencies in 12 states had been participating in experimental research that violated every ethical standard for child placement services, and that federal agencies had been coordinating experimental programs without congressional authorization or public oversight. The investigations also revealed that the temporal family dynamics research had created psychological problems for many of the children who had been placed through chronological manipulation. Identity confusion, anxiety disorders, and relationship difficulties were common among people who had been raised by alternate versions of themselves or their relatives without understanding the true nature of their family relationships. But the most significant long-term impact of Margaret's revelation was the establishment of comprehensive ethical standards for adoption services and child welfare research that protected children's rights to accurate information about their identities and family histories. Federal legislation prohibited experimental manipulation of family relationships and required full disclosure of research objectives when children were involved in any form of social science study. The Temporal Family Dynamics program was dismantled through criminal prosecutions that resulted in convictions for dozens of adoption workers, researchers, and government officials who had participated in experimental manipulation of children's lives. The cases established legal precedents for protecting children's rights against scientific research that violated their dignity and autonomy in the name of advancing knowledge about human development. Margaret Henley was initially charged with child endangerment for her participation in temporal family dynamics placements, but the charges were dropped in exchange for her cooperation with federal investigations. She continued working in child welfare services, but dedicated the remainder of her career to advocating for ethical standards that protected children from exploitation by researchers and institutions that prioritized experimental objectives over individual well-being. Timothy Walsh was reunited with his original family through careful investigation that revealed his true identity and family history. The experience of being raised by his own adult self had created lasting psychological effects, but he was able to develop healthy relationships and a stable sense of identity through therapeutic support and family counseling. He lived until 1987, dying peacefully, surrounded by family members who understood and accepted his unusual childhood experiences. The Temporal Family Dynamics case became a foundational example in social work education, demonstrating how innovative approaches to social problems could be perverted to serve experimental objectives that violated the fundamental rights and dignity of the people they were supposed to help. Social work students continue to study Margaret's experience as a cautionary example of how good intentions could be manipulated to serve unethical research goals. Modern child welfare researchers studying the Temporal Family Dynamics case have found evidence that similar experimental programs may have been attempted in other countries during the early 20th century, suggesting that manipulation of family relationships for research purposes was an international phenomena associated with the development of modern social science and government administration. The case also established important precedents for protecting children's rights against experimental research that claims to benefit them but actually serves primarily to advance scientific knowledge or institutional interests. Legal principles developed in response to the Temporal Family Dynamics scandal continue to influence contemporary debates about children's participation in social science research and the ethics of innovative approaches to child welfare services. If this story has made you more aware of how child welfare systems can be manipulated to serve research objectives that prioritize scientific advancement over children's well-being, please share it with others who work in social services, child welfare, or family court systems. Subscribe for more historical cases where individual courage exposed systematic violations of vulnerable people's rights that were disguised as beneficial institutional services. Before you go, take a moment to consider, are there programs, services, or research initiatives in your community that claim to help children but haven't been subject to appropriate ethical oversight or transparency requirements? Margaret Henley's experience with temporal family dynamics reminds us that the most harmful violations of children's rights often occur within institutions that claim to be protecting their best interests. Remember, Margaret's most important insight wasn't about adoption procedures or family relationships. It was about the responsibility that comes with professional authority over vulnerable people's lives. When you have the power to make decisions that affect children's development in family relationships, you also have an obligation to ensure that those decisions serve the children's genuine interests rather than experimental objectives or institutional convenience. Next week, we'll explore another case where someone discovered that their professional expertise was being used to facilitate systematic violations of vulnerable people's rights that were disguised as beneficial services designed to help them. Until then, remember that the most important questions aren't always about whether innovative approaches work or achieve their stated objectives, but about whether they treat people with the dignity and respect that ethical principles are designed to protect.